Don't touch that manuscript. Too late.
I decoded it, and the first name hidden inside was mine.
The first word I translated from the dead man's manuscript was my own name. The second was murder. And when I looked up, the museum director, the man who had laughed at me less than an hour earlier, was locking the archive door from the inside. Hello, my name is Eli Mercer. I was 17 years old when this happened, and I had been homeless for 8 months. Most people who passed me on the streets of Baltimore saw a dirty coat, a split backpack, and a kid they hoped would keep walking. They never imagined I could read 5 ancient languages. They certainly never imagined I could expose a crime that had been buried for almost a century. But before I tell you how that manuscript changed my life, I need to tell you about my mother. Her name was Dr. Rachel Mercer. She taught ancient history at a small college in Maryland. She believed languages were not just words. She said every language was a door, and every person who learned one was given a key. When I was 6, she taught me Greek letters with refrigerator magnets. At 9, I could read simple Latin. At 12, I was helping her compare old Syriac prayers with their later translations. We never had much money, but our apartment was full of books. To me, it felt richer than any palace. Then my mother got sick. The cancer moved fast. Medical bills swallowed our savings. The college replaced her before she was even gone. 3 months after her funeral, our landlord changed the locks. I carried everything I owned in one backpack: 2 shirts, a notebook, my mother's old dictionary, and a brass key she had worn on a chain around her neck. I slept in shelters when there was room. When there was not, I slept behind a church near Mount Vernon. During the day, I stayed warm in public libraries and museums. Museums were perfect because nobody asked questions if I stood still and looked interested. That was how I found the Ashcroft manuscript. The Halden Museum of World History was hosting a private preview for a new exhibit called Voices of the Lost Kingdoms. The main attraction was a blackened bundle of parchment discovered inside a sealed wooden chest in the estate of industrialist Silas Ashcroft. Ashcroft had made a fortune in railroads, weapons, and stolen land. According to the museum's signs, the manuscript had been brought to America in 1928 by an unnamed traveler. No one knew where it came from. No one could read it. That last claim caught my attention. The manuscript was displayed behind thick glass. The letters looked like a mixture of Greek, Aramaic, and something older. Museum experts had decided it was a religious text written in a lost dialect. A gold plaque announced that Dr. Adrian Vale, director of the Halden Museum, would lead an international team to decode it. I stared at the first visible page for 20 minutes. Then I saw the mistake. The writing was not one lost language. It was 3 familiar languages woven together. Every third word changed systems: Greek, Syriac, Old Church Slavonic, then back to Greek. The writer had not been confused. He had been hiding something. I whispered, "It's a rotating cipher." A woman beside me heard. She wore a silver museum badge that read Dr. Senior Curator. "What did you say?" she asked. I pointed at the glass. The words rotate through 3 languages. You're reading each line as one system, but it changes every third word. She looked at me, then at my torn gloves. Her expression tightened. "The public preview is downstairs," she said. "I know, but this part says witness, not prayer." She stepped closer. "You cannot possibly know that." 2 other experts turned toward us. One of them gave a quiet laugh. Vale walked over a moment later. He was tall, silver-haired, and polished in the way powerful men often are. Even his smile looked expensive. "Dr. Price told him I claimed to understand the manuscript." Vale looked me up and down. "And where did you study ancient languages?" "My mother taught me." "At which university?" "At home." The experts laughed. Vale did not. He leaned toward me and lowered his voice. "Young man, this artifact has challenged scholars for decades. It is not a puzzle from a cereal box." "Then your scholars missed something obvious." His smile disappeared. Security grabbed my arm. As they led me away, I pointed to the last line visible under the glass. It says, "When the house of Ashcroft opens the tomb, follow the nameless son." For the first time, outside, cold rain was falling. The guards pushed me through the staff entrance and warned me not to return. I should have walked away. I had enough problems without fighting a museum full of rich people. Then someone slipped an envelope into my coat pocket. I turned, but the alley was empty. Inside the envelope was a photograph of another manuscript page. On the back, someone had written, "Your mother was right. Locker 3014, Penn Station." My hands began to shake. My mother had never mentioned the Halden Museum. At least, I did not remember her mentioning it. But the handwriting on the photograph looked familiar. It resembled the notes in the margins of her dictionary. I reached Penn Station just before midnight. Locker 314 opened with the brass key from my mother's necklace. Inside was a small metal box. The box contained $40, a cheap phone, a flash drive, and a letter addressed to me. The letter was from my mother. "Eli, if you are reading this, I failed to keep the truth buried until you were safe. Trust the languages. Trust no one at the Halden Museum. The Ashcroft manuscript is not a religious text. It is a confession, a map, and a list of names. Your name is one of them." I read those lines again and again. At the bottom she had written one final warning. "If Adrian Vale learns you have the key, he will kill for it." The cheap phone rang. I almost dropped it. A woman said, "Eli, my name is Mara Quinn. I worked with your mother. If you want to live through tonight, do not use the main exit." "Where are you?" "Close enough to see the man in the gray coat walking toward your locker." I looked up. A broad man with a scar across his chin was moving through the crowd. I recognized him as one of the museum guards. I ran. I pushed through a service door, crossed 2 tracks by an underground passage, and came out beside a parking garage. The man followed. I heard his shoes slapping the wet concrete behind me. Mara guided me through the phone, left at the vending machines, down the maintenance stairs, through the red door. When I reached the street, a dark sedan stopped beside me. The passenger door opened. "Get in," Mara said. She was in her early 50s, with short black hair and a burn scar on one hand. I climbed in. She drove before I had closed the door. Mara told me she had been an investigative reporter. 15 years earlier, she had started researching artifacts that passed through the Halden Museum. Many had been stolen from war zones. Some were connected to private collectors, corrupt diplomats, and wealthy families. My mother had helped her translate shipping records. Then they found references to the Ashcroft manuscript. "Your mother believed it documented a massacre," Mara said. "In 1927, Silas Ashcroft funded an illegal expedition in what is now northern Syria. The team found a hidden archive beneath a ruined monastery. Ashcroft took the artifacts and killed the local guides who knew the location. Why would my name be in a manuscript written in 1927? Amara glanced at the key around my neck because part of it was added later. She drove me to an abandoned print shop near the harbor. Inside, walls were covered with photographs, maps, and copies of museum records. My mother's face appeared in several pictures. Seeing her there hurt more than I expected. Mara inserted the flash drive into an old laptop. Most files were encrypted, but one folder opened. It contained photographs of 12 manuscript pages and an audio recording from my mother. Her voice filled the room. "Eli, the cipher is based on a lullaby I taught you. The languages rotate according to the notes. If you remember the song, you can read the hidden layer." I remembered. My mother used to sing that lullaby during thunderstorms. 7 notes repeated in a strange order. I had assumed it was just a song. It was a key. For the next 3 hours. The first layer described the Ashcroft expedition. The second listed artifacts taken from the monastery. The third was written by a surviving guide named Thomas Aram, who followed Ashcroft to America. Thomas hid evidence inside the manuscript and passed the decoding key to his children. Then I reached a page dated 1998. It had been added by Thomas's granddaughter, my grandmother. My mother had never told me our family came from the only witness who survived Ashcroft's massacre. The nameless son was not a person. It was a phrase meaning an heir whose identity had been concealed. That heir was me. The manuscript said the brass key opened a compartment beneath the museum's original cornerstone. Inside were the expedition journals, photographs of the killings, and legal records proving the monastery archive belonged to the descendants of the murdered guides. There was also a list of modern men who had protected the secret. Adrian Vale's father was on it. So was Adrian Vale. Mara wanted to call federal investigators immediately. I stopped her. We had photographs, but Vale could claim they were fake. We needed the evidence under the museum. Then we go public first, she said. Before we could move, every light in the print shop went out. The back window shattered. Mara shoved me behind a printing press as two men entered. One carried a flashlight. The other had the scar across his chin. They poured gasoline over the floor. Mara whispered, "Take the drive. There's a tunnel under the paper lift. I'm not leaving you. Your mother once saved my life. Let me repay her." She threw a metal tray across the room. The crash drew the men away. I opened the lift and crawled into a narrow service tunnel, just as flames rose behind me. The tunnel ended at a storm drain near the harbor. I came out coughing, covered in soot, with the flash drive between my teeth. Fire engines arrived within minutes. I watched from beneath the pier as the print shop burned. Mara did not come out. By morning, the news reported one unidentified body inside. Something inside me broke. For months, I had survived by becoming invisible. I never argued. I never trusted. I never stayed anywhere long enough to matter. But Vale had taken my mother's work, my family's history, and now Mara's life. I decided I was done running. The Halden Museum was holding a gala that night to unveil Vale's first translation of the Ashcroft manuscript. Wealthy donors, television crews, and city officials would all be there. I spent the last of the money from the locker at a thrift store. I bought a black suit, shoes half a size too small, and a white shirt with a stain hidden under the collar. I cut my hair in a bus station bathroom. Then I used Mara's press credentials to enter the gala through the media door. No one recognized the homeless boy in a suit. Vale stood on stage beneath a giant image of the manuscript. He announced that his team had discovered a devotional poem about obedience and sacrifice. The audience applauded. I almost laughed. The text behind him did mention sacrifice. It described the sacrifice of innocent people for Ashcroft's fortune. I moved through the crowd toward the oldest wing of the museum. According to the manuscript, the cornerstone compartment was below a statue of Silas Ashcroft. The gallery was closed, but my mother's brass key opened a service door behind the statue. A stairway descended into darkness. At the bottom, I found a stone marked with 3 alphabets. I pressed the letters in the order of my mother's lullaby. A narrow panel opened. Inside was a leather case. I pulled it out and heard slow applause behind me. Vale stood on the stairs with the scarred guard. Dr. Lena Price was beside them. "Remarkable," Vale said. "Rachel always believed you would finish her work. You knew my mother, of course. She translated half the manuscript for me. Then she developed a conscience. Did you kill her?" Vale smiled. "Cancer killed your mother. I simply made certain she lost her job, her insurance, and every place willing to publish her claims." The words hit me harder than a fist. He had not caused the disease, but he had turned it into a weapon. He had watched us lose everything and called it protection. "And Mara?" I asked. The guard answered. "She should have stayed retired." Vale held out his hand. "Give me the case, Eli. I can make this easy. Money, education, a new identity. You could become the scholar your mother wanted you to be." "You mean I could become like you?" His face hardened. "You are a homeless child with stolen credentials. No one will believe you." That was when Dr. Price stepped forward and slapped handcuffs onto the scarred guard. Vale stared at her. She pulled a federal badge from inside her jacket. "Actually," she said, "we believe him. Dr. Lena Price was not a curator. She was an agent with the FBI art crime team. She had spent 2 years inside the museum tracing stolen artifacts and illegal payments. She had slipped the photograph into my coat. She had sent the first warning, but Vale was not finished. He grabbed the leather case and ran up the stairs. I chased him into the gala hall. He reached the stage while the audience was still watching a video presentation. Then the giant screen changed. Instead of Vale's fake translation, my mother's files appeared. Photographs of the expedition journals filled the screen. Names, dates, bank transfers, and images of stolen artifacts followed. Mara's voice came through the speakers. "Adrian, you always did underestimate people you considered powerless." She walked out from behind the media platform, her burned hand wrapped in a bandage. Mara was alive. The body in the print shop had belonged to one of the attackers, trapped when part of the ceiling collapsed. Mara had escaped through a second passage and sent copies of the files to every major newsroom in the city. Vale looked around for an exit, but federal agents were already moving through the crowd. He opened the leather case and pulled out a pistol. People screamed. He grabbed me by the collar and pressed the gun against my neck. "Turn off the screen," he shouted. I could feel his hand shaking. On the screen was a photograph of my grandmother as a child, standing beside Thomas Aram. Beneath it was the legal trust that transferred ownership of the stolen archive to the victim's descendants. Vale whispered, "You think this gives you power?" "No," I said. "The truth gives all of them power." I stepped backward onto his injured foot. He cried out. I twisted away. Dr. Price fired once, striking his shoulder. The gun fell across the stage. Vale collapsed beneath the giant image of the people his family had tried to erase. The audience did not applaud this time. They watched in silence as he was taken away. The investigation lasted 14 months. Adrian Vale was convicted of conspiracy, trafficking stolen cultural property, obstruction of justice, attempted murder, and several financial crimes. The guard received 22 years in federal prison. 3 museum trustees resigned. 2 were indicted. The Halden Museum returned 47 artifacts to the communities they had been taken from. The Ashcroft Family Foundation lost control of the museum. A restitution fund was created from assets seized during the investigation, and the Great Silas Ashcroft Gallery was renamed. It became the Aram Center for Recovered History. Mara published the investigation under my mother's name as co-author. Dr. Price helped me enter a housing program and complete high school. A university offered me a scholarship, but I did not accept until they agreed to create a program for students without stable housing. Some people called that generosity. It was not. It was my revenge. Vale had used doors to keep people out: museum doors, university doors, doors to safe homes, doors to the truth. I wanted every one of those doors forced open. 5 years later, I stood inside the Aram Center on the opening night of a new exhibition. The Ashcroft manuscript rested behind glass, but its full translation was available free to anyone. No private collection. No powerful man deciding who deserved to read history. Near the entrance was a small brass plaque for my mother. Dr. Rachel Mercer, teacher, translator, and keeper of the truth. I touched the old key around my neck. A boy of about 13 stood beside me. His clothes were worn, and he carried everything he owned in a grocery bag. A guard had been following him from room to room. The boy pointed at a line in the manuscript and said, "I think the museum translated that word wrong." The guard started to move toward him. I raised my hand. "Let him speak," I said. The boy explained what he saw. He was nervous, but he was right. So I gave him a notebook, invited him into the archive, and opened the door my mother had once opened for me. The powerful men who erased my family believed revenge meant destroying them. They were wrong. My revenge was making sure that no one like them would ever control the truth again.